sleepy. Peter was probably put on his glasses and maybe take a nap. I'm here to talk to you about how you can get started using AngularJS. I have a bit of an agenda today. We're going to start off by first trying to answer this question. What exactly is AngularJS? So that's going to level set for us. Then we're going to talk about how we can organize and bootstrap our application using modules. Then we're going to talk about how we could add behavior to our application using controllers and scope. How we can manipulate the DOM using AngularJS directives. And how we can actually manipulate the data that's presented to the user using filters. But before we get to any of that, a little bit about me. That's my Twitter handle, if you want to follow me. I've been in Delaware now for 6 years. That's what LinkedIn tells me. LinkedIn actually says 5 years, 9 months. I'm going to round up and say 6 years. I've been a team lead on several projects. And it seems nowadays I'm actually writing less Java code as my career progresses. And I really don't mind because I really like JavaScript. And I really like Node.js. And I like CSS and HTML. I've done work for the mobile team, ICT retail, and financial services. And since about, I think it's April, I've been working on the Mercedes-Benz Canada Co-op marketing portal. It's a mouthful. And we're actually using AngularJS on this application. And we're serving up Angular from a Node.js backend. So that's full stack JavaScript, which is kind of cool. But we're not the only ones using AngularJS here in Delaware. The Health Pro team is using AngularJS. There's been some talk, from what I understand, at the JS study group here in Delaware. And I know that Daniela's put together a bit of a sample app that she's going to be showcasing in the next few weeks, I believe. I know Jean's been also working on something on his own time, sharpening his skills using AngularJS and Node.js, which is cool. And back in February, Ken Stevens spent some time at the AngularJS spa. He wrote a blog post of how he started out with Bootstrap on a hobby project of his, and then he tried out Angular for the same project. So let's try to answer this question. I'll do my best with this, but I think it's actually pretty straightforward. AngularJS is a JavaScript framework for building web applications, and in my opinion, I think this is kind of a loaded statement. We're actually writing JavaScript, and as Java programmers, we've been avoiding JavaScript for a pretty long time. We have Java code outputting JavaScript for us. When we're using Angular, we're writing JavaScript the entire time. It's a framework and not a library. So similar to how Wicket is a framework for us in Java and Apache Commons is a library, AngularJS is a framework for building web applications in the browser. And it's used for building applications. So you wouldn't really use AngularJS for an informational site. You're actually going to use it to build an application that's going to run in the browser. So what kind of applications do we build with AngularJS? Why do we build single-page web applications? So this isn't a requirement, but this is typically what you do with AngularJS. And a single-page web application has a few benefits. It gives a much more responsive experience to the user. And especially in a mobile context, it does make a lot of sense. So you would hear this term SPA, that's the abbreviation for single-page web application. And in a single-page web application, what you have is you have one web page, and this is typically referred to your shell page. And when the user asks to, let's say, see a new page, rather than reloading the entire page, what you do is you just load this content area. And we typically refer to this as a partial. So you designate a particular part of your web page as the area that's going to be holding your content. And that fragment can live on the server, but it can also be embedded directly inside of your shell page. So is AngularJS an MVC, an MVP, an MVVM? Is it? I don't know. So an MVC, in an MVC architectural pattern, you have a controller that kind of sits and straddles both sides of your app. It straddles the view and it straddles the model. And the model doesn't know anything about the view, and the view doesn't know anything about the model. The controller is notified of changes in the view, and then it will update the model. And when the model changes, it'll ask the view to update itself. An MVVM is kind of similar, but the view is actually given a view model, which is a representation of the model that it can bind itself to. So what is AngularJS? Well, it's a super heroic JavaScript MVW framework. I know what you're thinking. MVW, what is MVW? Really, what is MVW? It actually stands for Model View Whatever, and I'm not joking. Model View Whatever. So this is a quote from one of the co-leads on the AngularJS project. And this is what he says: "I'd rather see developers build quick, blank apps that are well designed and follow separation of concerns than see them waste time arguing about MV nonsense. And for this reason, I hereby declare AngularJS to be MVW framework. Model View Whatever, where whatever stands for whatever works for you." It's funny, but it's kind of cool too. So let's talk a little bit about the features of an AngularJS application. So we're able to build reusable components that we can use on our project, but also in other projects. We get two-way data binding. We really get a separation of concerns when we're talking about MVW. We get internationalization and localization. I had never seen dependency injection in JavaScript until I came to AngularJS, which is kind of cool. So if you're coming from a Spring background, it's pretty interesting. We're going to see some of that in the examples that I'm going to show you. It's also embeddable, and what I mean by embeddable is that you don't need to turn your entire web page into an Angular application. You can turn just a subset of your page into an Angular application. So you can imagine that could be pretty useful, where you have a legacy application and you want to bring in some AngularJS into your application. You can just define, hey, I just want this div to be my AngularJS app. Or if you're working in a portal, that can make a lot of sense too, because you could have many different AngularJS applications running on the same page, which is kind of cool. And this one makes me feel really happy because it's very testable. The AngularJS project, the guys that work on the team are very test-driven development centric. So testability is a first-class concern when it comes to AngularJS. And it's important when we're talking about JavaScript because JavaScript is a dynamically typed language. So the compiler isn't there to warn you, but more importantly is that you're able to verify that your app does what it's supposed to be doing. Who likes writing their tests first? Yay! Yay! Yay!
Don't worry, bro. I'm here for you.
Okay. Let's talk about the parts. It all starts with a module. And when we talk about a Java application, there is a main method that gets kicked off, and it'll bootstrap your application for you. When we're talking about a JavaScript application, there isn't a main method. There's the onload event, and there is the document content loaded event. That's where we typically would have bootstrapped our application. So if we've worked with jQuery in the past, we'd listen for that DOM content loaded event, and then we'd start wiring up and binding to buttons and things like that. Does anybody know the difference between DOM content loaded and onload?
One of them happens when the actual page is completely loaded, the other happens when all the assets are ready, everything's ready to fire.
Exactly. So onload, it's only going to run once everything has been downloaded. All images, all of that stuff has been downloaded to your page. DOM content loaded is the earliest point where we can start binding to stuff. So under the covers, AngularJS is actually going to use the DOM content loaded event. And you could manually bootstrap your application that way if you wanted to. But the proper way to do it really is to use a module. And this gives us an opportunity to configure and kick off our application. Another thing about the module is that you can define the dependencies for your application using a module. So inside of a module, we register a few things. We register controllers, which give our applications behavior, directives, which allow us to manipulate the HTML, and services. I'm going to describe this as services. There are actually factories, providers, and services. I'm just going to generalize it and call it services. And one thing you don't see in this box is you don't see filters. So let's jump into an example. So in here I have, for example, we can look at. It's always hard to type with your neck.
Hope there's no expectation that we can read that.
No, there isn't. This is for me. There is an expectation you can read this. So I'm going to start right from the beginning. And we're going to build on this application. And this is really simple. And I am serving this up from Node.js if you're interested. So this is the app that we're building. It's a thoughts application. And it's a way for us to enter. Hey. So you can see here I can keep it tense. So if we just do can't spell. So this is all client side. This isn't making any server side requests. So it's pretty straightforward, really simple. And let's start breaking apart this application. So I'm going to start with the HTML, and here's the shell page. Can you guys see that back there? Kind of? Okay, I'll make it even bigger. So, can you see that now? Okay. It all starts with this. I don't know what line that is because it's being clipped, but it all starts by bringing in the Angular JavaScript file. And you notice that I'm actually putting the script tags at the bottom. There's a reason for that. It's kind of best practice. When you make a reference to a script tag that you're going to basically download from the server, it's going to block rendering. So the best practice is to move this to the bottom of the page. So we bring in AngularJS. We also bring in another JavaScript file, which is actually our application. And we then bring in our controller. And now if we look at this stuff, we actually define our application up here. And this NG does not stand for next generation. This is the namespace for Angular. And we basically say, hey, this entire page is an AngularJS application. We then indicate that this section block has a controller bound to it called thought controllers. Thought controller. And we're using another directive. These are called directives, so ng-controller. We're defining it as using a thought controller. We're also saying that when you go to submit this form, we need to be calling an add thought method defined in the current scope. So that would be on the thought controller. We then have an input field to actually register our thoughts. And we use another directive here called ng-model. And what this is doing is it's creating a model called thought on the current scope. We're going to get more into that. And as we enter things, we're actually going to iterate over all of our thoughts using this directive, ng-repeat. And then we simply use this data binding directive to actually output the current thought that we're iterating. Kind of cool, right? And now let's look at the actual JavaScript. So we'll start from the top again. So there's our thoughts app. And this is how we define it. So we use the AngularJS namespace, and then we declare that we want to define a module, and we want to call it thoughts app. This guy hanging out on the end is a JavaScript notation for declaring an array. This second parameter would represents the dependencies that you want to inject into this module. In this case, we don't have any dependencies, but as we progress, you're going to see that we will have. And then we have our thought controller. Can you see that? So we get a handle on our thoughts app using the Angular namespace. You'll notice I'm not passing the array in here. And then we declare a controller in this module, in our thoughts application, and we give it the name thought controller. This second parameter, which is the function, is actually the implementation of our controller. And you'll notice that we get this kind of, this funny looking variable called $sign scope. That is the scope object that was created in the page. We define a thoughts array on that scope object, and now that becomes available to the web page. And we also define our add thought method. If you recall, when we submitted the form, we had to call add thought. And what we simply do is we push the current thought onto the thoughts array. And then I just clear out the field here. Any questions about that? All right. So when your application starts to gets to a certain size, you want to start, your controllers can get to be pretty hairy, so you want to start breaking out some of that code. And that's where services start to come in. So we want to lean out our controller, and I'm going to check out simple thoughts. So our app should still be working the same way. Nothing's changed there, except for we're now asking our factory for data. And if we look then in our controller, we're asking AngularJS to inject a dependency for us called thought factory. And rather than declaring the array inside of our controller, we ask the thought factory to give us our thoughts. Everything else is kind of the same except for this. When the user hits add thought, we actually remember the thought rather than just pushing it on the array that we had previously. So let's look at that factory. So we got a handle on the thoughts app, and we asked to declare a thought factory object. And the second parameter here is the function that's actually going to be returning the thought factory. And here's where we initialize our array. We return the thought factory, and the thought factory has the two methods on it that we just saw in the controller. There's the get thoughts and the remember thought methods. I'm going to go back to these slides. Oh, there's one more thing I want to show you. All right. So now what I've done is I've just brought in a filter. I'm going to show you how it's actually working. But essentially now we're ordering these elements. So if we go back to our show page, our ng repeat has changed slightly. What we do is we take our array of thoughts and we pipe it into what we call a filter. And AngularJS has built-in filters, and one of them is order by. So we're asking to order our thoughts in ascending order. So that's an example of a filter. We'll see more filters as we progress through the presentation. So let's now dig a little bit deeper into modules. So we talked briefly about how a module is used to bootstrap your application, but it's also useful for organizing our application. So when we talk about organizing our application, the recommendation from AngularJS, the guys that I did AngularJS, is you don't just have one big monolithic application. What you do is you actually split your application across by defining services as a module, directives as a module, filters as a module, and controllers as a module. And then what you do is you declare a top-level module which represents your application, and you would then inject those things into your main application. So when we bootstrap an application, there are actually two phases. There's a configuration phase, and there's also the run phase. In the configuration phase, we've seen it already where we've used the .controller or the .factory. That's where we're able to declare things. In the run phase, we actually start working with instances of these objects. I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's look at simple thoughts. So the app should still be the same. Our dependencies have changed slightly. Now we're asking for thought controllers as opposed to thought controller, and thought providers as opposed to just a thought provider. So what we were doing before is we were simply getting a handle on the thoughts app and then declaring a factory on it. What we're doing now is we're actually defining a new module called thought providers. And in this case, again, we don't have any dependencies. But then if we look at our thought controllers, we've defined a thought controllers module, and hey, we depend on the thought providers module. Everything else still works the same. Thought factory gets injected, as we would expect it to. In our Thoughts app, this is now our top-level module, has two dependencies. So we declare a Thoughts app, and we ask to be injected with thought controllers and thought providers. Anybody working with AngularJS, are you approaching your projects this way? You guys? One module?
One module per portlet. So we're in a life-ray environment. So we bootstrap each portlet as its own app, and that's the boundary.
Any portlet communication or
Nope.
each is his own little thing? And
There's some life-ray context that's shared, like who you're logged in as and stuff.
All right. I want to show you another example here of how we can actually configure and bootstrap our application. So we had simple thoughts. Now we're going to have some deep thoughts. And just trying to remember which one I should actually be checking out here. I guess this is okay. So we're actually also going to turn our application into a single page web application. So we default to simple thoughts, but we can also start entering some deep thoughts on the side. So we're making an AJAX request for these new templates, and we're simply just replacing a particular area of the page. So let's look at the code. So the HTML has changed a little bit. If you recall, we had our form sitting in this HTML5 section element. There's a new directive here called ng-view. And this is telling AngularJS, when you ask for a new view, that response should be put in this area. And then we have a few links here. So how do we do that? We have to use the configuration phase. So in our module, we say during the config phase, we want to be given the route provider, which is an AngularJS service. And what we do in the route provider is we say, when you're asking for slash, we want you to get your template from here. That could be server side, that could be client side. And once that template is loaded, we want you to bind that template to the thought controller. And then when you ask to see some deep thoughts, the URL is different, but we're still using the same controller. If you can't find any of that stuff, we're going to default back to the application root. So let's enter a deep thought. All right. That seems to be working. I want to show you the config block. Sorry, one block is what I meant to say. So this is the same code where this is the configuration phase. By the way, you can have many config blocks as you want and as many run blocks as you want. In the run phase, I told you we were dealing with instances. So this thought factory has already been initialized, and what we do in the run phase is we want to prefix our thoughts with this text. So that's actually setting it on the instance. And if we go to deep thoughts, it's prefixing. So the structure of our factory has changed a little bit. I can show you what that looks like. We just added a new method here to our factory. And then that just gets used here. When we go to remember our thoughts, we just prefix it to the thought. All right. Any questions about modules before I move on? BC Holmes.
Yeah, so you started off showing us an example whereby you are binding a particular anchor on a field to a method on a controller. Is it that a controller method has been invoked that causes Angular to re-render the section? Or is it that you change the scope that causes it to re-render the section? And I ask this question because I'm really interested in how do you deal with like push notification from, say, the server?
That's a really great question.
Go me.
The answer that I have for you is this basically, it's watching for changes on the scope and it's just updating the page. When we move through the presentation, you'll see how the scope object can actually emit events that you can listen for. And that would be really well suited for data coming back from, let's say, a WebSocket or something. Great question. Let's move on to controllers and scope. So we've seen this stuff already used throughout our examples, and if you need to display data and it needs to accept data, but in order to be a good citizen, it can't talk directly to the controller. And the controller has data and it wants to display it, but it can't talk directly to the view. So these guys need to use the scope object, and you've already seen examples of this. So the scope object allows a controller to define methods on the scope that the view can call. We saw the add thought method in our form submit. But it can also define methods on the scope that allow the view to change the model data. So a save, for example. The controller can register to watch the changes on the model, and the controller can also emit events. I just mentioned this on the scope for other controllers to be aware of. So here's where we're going to watch for model changes. So in this example, we have an input field, and it's binding the employee.is quitting time to the model. And some code, possibly a controller, wants to watch this property for changes. And once it's quitting time for this employee, it wants the punch clock to actually end the shift. So we're actually watching the change of a model object on the scope. You'll notice that I'm wrapping this call in an if statement because Angular is going to call this several times in order for it to settle kind of the state of the world. So you actually want to do this check, and you can compare the new value to the old value to see if you actually need to do something special. What's also interesting is that we can do deep watches on an object. So this watch actually takes a third parameter, which is a Boolean, that says, I want to watch all changes on an object. Any property that changes on an object, I want you to tell me that it's actually changed. So that's watching. So you can imagine you have a WebSocket, and a WebSocket is updating an object somewhere, and your controller needs to do something interesting, it would watch this object. You can also emit events. So in this case, we want to emit a celebrate birthday event, and when that happens, we actually want to pass the employee object to anything that's listening. So here's where we emit the event, and here's where we register to listen for the celebrate birthday event. And you can see we get the employee object as the second parameter. I think this is kind of cool. We get the day off when it's your birthday. Let's talk about directives. So we've seen directives throughout the application. We saw ngapp, ngrepeat, ngmodel. These are all things that kind of decorate your HTML. But those were just a few. AngularJS actually has a bunch of them built in. So there's ng double click, ng submit, ng change, disabled. We're going to see an example of that one in a second. ng hide, I want to show and hide an element, so we use the ng hide and ng show, the ng repeat, and the ng view. So let's see how we can disable a button using AngularJS. So I want to only be able to save a thought if I can actually submit a thought. So this function is actually declared on the scope. And this Boolean will actually show or enable or disable this particular button. We can actually show a message with a directive as well. So I only want to show this error panel if I have error messages. And then you can see here that we also use the data binding directive. What's really cool is you can roll your own directives too. You can pretty much roll your own anything. Directives, filters. You can do that with AngularJS. And you can apply a directive to elements, which is kind of weird. You're actually creating your own HTML tags with AngularJS. I'm going to show you how we do that in a second. You can create a directive that applies to an attribute. That's what we've seen already throughout the presentation. Class, I've never used that one. Comment, I really have never used that one. But you can also do a combination of all of these things. ng dash whatever does not exist in HTML anywhere. So how does that pass any sort of HTML validator? How many people validate their HTML? That's what I thought. Not a lot of people. But there is a way to make your HTML valid. So if you were dealing with XML, you would define it this way. ng:click do something. In HTML5, you prefix it with data dash. In XHTML, we would prefix it with X. That should give you some valid HTML. So let's look at a directive. Oops. So I want to know how many thoughts I actually have. let's go to simple. I have 0 thoughts. So you kind of get the idea. This is all happening in the browser. I'm sure you understand that by now. Here's how we actually define a directive. You'll notice that the structure of my application, you probably can't see this back here, but I'm declaring folders for controllers, directives, and services. So I created a new directory called directives, and in here, I define a directive. So I've created a module called thought directives. Again, no dependencies. And then I associate a thought counter directive to my thought directives module. And the second parameter is the function that gets called in order to return this directive. So we return an object, and I want to tell you that when you're dealing with directives, there's probably about 20 different switches that you can use to work with a directive. I'm only going to show you 4 of them. Basically, with restrict, with the E, I'm actually saying I want to create a brand new HTML element called thought counter. And this is the HTML that I want AngularJS to output, so it's a span. And we're using the current scope to count the number of elements on our array. And replace will say whatever HTML you have there, whatever HTML tag you've made up, we're actually going to replace that tag with what we've declared in this line over here. And in this line, we get a handle on the current element that we're dealing with, and we take our template and we inject it as HTML. Does this look familiar to anybody? This is jQuery. Actually, AngularJS ships with something called JQLite, which gives you a jQuery-like API. But if you were to declare jQuery before you declare AngularJS, AngularJS will actually use the full-blown jQuery. So you get all the power of jQuery here. So let me show you the HTML. There's really not a lot to see here. Besides, this guy down here. So that's our thought counter. So when AngularJS runs, it's going to replace this HTML with the span that we just saw in the template. Something else that I want to mention about that template is that this template can actually be a URL too. You can specify template URL, and it will fetch that template from the server, or if you've embedded it in a script tag in your page, it'll read it from there, which is kind of cool. So fewer server requests. So we've created our own directive. Let's move on and talk about filters. So a filter is when we actually want to do something to the data before we actually present it to the user. And we already saw an example with the order by, where we started ordering thoughts. But again, AngularJS has a bunch of stuff already built in. It has a filter for currency, for date, order by that we already saw. So we'll see examples of limit 2, uppercase, lowercase. So we take our balance and we want to format it as currency. We want to start shouting, so we're going to take this value, we're going to uppercase it. Limit 2 I think is kind of interesting, where we have this array and we only want to show 3 elements out of that array. And we can also format our dates, and it takes a bunch of formatting strings that you can pass in there. So when I pass in short date, that's the output that I get. But the real power of a filter is you can chain them. So you can take your expression and you can run it through all of these filters, which is kind of cool. Let me show you an example of that. So I know you've been thinking, that's a pretty hideous looking UI. that doesn't get any better. I actually want to be able to find the thoughts that I've entered. So I have a search field here, and we're going to use a filter in order to do that. So I'm going to enter some thoughts. So this is going to do an in-place search for us, and if I type in I, nothing's changed. If I type in like, nothing's changed. If I do that, it starts filtering my results. Again, this is all happening in the browser. So you can see how you can get a really responsive user experience here. Let me show you what that looks like in implementation. So we look at our HTML. Oh, sorry, wrong place. I think I applied the search only to this particular. So we're piping our array through 2 different filters. So we filter, this is a built-in Angular directive. We actually want to filter based on the input that we've defined at the top. So you can see I have an input field here at line 16 called thought search. So what AngularJS has done is it's just created something in the scope called thought search, and that's going to hold the value that the user's typing into the input field. As that value changes, Angular is going to do its magic, and it's going to start repeating these elements again. It's going to run through the filter, and it's going to base it off of the value in this model. And we still want things to be ordered by in ascending order. Sorry. I'm also doing something here where I'm turning the thought into lowercase. How am I doing for time? Awesome, that's exactly what I want it to be. So we've looked at a bunch of stuff today. We've looked at modules, how to organize your application, how to bootstrap them, how to add behavior to our application using controllers and scope, directives, and how we can manipulate our HTML, and how we can actually filter the data that gets presented to the user using filters. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. It's really hot in here. I know, I'm sweating. Any questions for me?
That part that you had with the emitting events and listening to events, what is the scope to which the event is dispatched? Is it like between controllers? Is it within the same controller? Or?
It's within the same scope. So anything, so in our HTML we defined a section tag and we defined an ng controller.
Right.
Anything that's inside of that has access to the scope. What's really cool is you can actually start nesting controllers. So we define a controller at this level. We can actually define a controller at a higher level, and it can be watching for changes or listening for changes on the scope.
And they share the scope.
They would share the scope. It's not broadcast throughout the entire application. You have to have access to the scope in order to register to listen to the event. Good question.
I know you just put together some examples. Do you have an example of the testing that's done for the code?
I didn't. I really wanted to because I really enjoy testing. I think that could be a really good second talk for AngularJS. In our project, we've been writing tests. There are 2 types of tests that we can write. You can write a unit test, which would really be testing, the directives or the controllers or the filters. But then you can also write end-to-end tests, which will actually test the binding of the UI to the controllers and do a full kind of integration test for you. Something that we use to run those tests is called Karma. That's what it's called now. It used to be called something different. It's actually pretty interesting because we have it integrated into our build process and all. That's a second talk. Yeah. DC?
So if somebody were starting a new project today,
Yes.
under what circumstances or under what conditions would you say they should use something like AngularJS or stick with something like JSP?
You need to know JavaScript. You need to know the language is what I was saying. I mean, you're writing JavaScript now. But I think if you want something that is going to scale really well, it makes sense to use something like AngularJS.
Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by scale?
You're putting the load on the client instead of the server. Michael? You're not sweating at all, by the way.
I'm very low down. View model versus model with a bunch of filters. Do you have an opinion? Where you do your UI transform?
I want to do it the AngularJS way.
I thought that was the whatever way.
Yes. I mean, what I like to do is I like to put logic in my controllers because I can test them. But I can also unit test filters and directives and test all of those things. So, I mean, in the end, I can test the controllers on their own, and I can write the end-to-end test that would really stitch all of that stuff together. Do you have a perspective on that?
No, we're writing that code now, and I'm not quite sure where, do I, because there's an HTTP service, I get a bunch of data, do I process that data before I put it on the scope, and then have the scope contain sort of user-ready presentation?
Right.
Or do I put sort of a more raw data blob on the scope, and then use filters to present it in a human readable format?
That's a really interesting question.
What do you guys do?
Well, we're doing a bit of both, actually, on the project. We're not doing end-to-end tests, so I like to put stuff into the controllers so that I can unit test them.
Is there a way to speed up dirty checking?
Not that I'm aware of. Is it giving you grief? What's dirty checking?
Well, they're using raw objects for the scope. In fact, the scope chain is actually the prototype chain, which is really cool and all JavaScripty. But then to detect changes, they just walk the entire tree of objects and compare them to the old values of the entire tree of objects and say, did anything change? Which is fine when there's 10 objects, but when there's 8,000 objects, it's not so fine. On every click, walking that whole tree, comparing every property against the old value. So it means that on our data tables, we can kind of cap it about 100 or 200 rows before IE 8 especially just falls over.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Well, it's a migration project from Silverlight, so we're helping them move in that direction, but the users have been told they can only use IE. So telling them they're not allowed to use IE would be a mixed message.
What version of Angular are you using?
Stable,
Okay.
which makes me sad because there's all sorts of things
Yeah.
that aren't there yet in 1 versus 1.1.
I unfortunately don't have an answer for you.
What feature of Tapestry do you most miss in Angular?
I don't miss any feature.
Language.
That was a trick question. Mr. Buckley? Yes, you're next. You're next. Wait, I'm first and then you.
Is there a way to pull like a widget out of this? I'm thinking like if you had a paging table or something like that, you want to pull it out.
Yeah, so you can create a directive. You can create a directive, and so he was Ivan was asking, how do you pull out a UI component, for example, like a page, table pager? And my answer is you would define a directive, and that directive can be used across projects. We actually created a paging directive in our project.
Can you put that into something like NPM or sure?
Yeah, absolutely. You can. Yeah. NPM isn't just about Node; it can be about, and it just packages. Mr. Powell.
Yeah, I'm just curious, using the single page application, so obviously you mentioned that it affects like scalability, it's a lot of work time.
Yeah.
Were there any other kind of impacts on the server side that you're communicating with that you might even have foreseen when you started using Angular, like the responsibilities of the server or anything like that?
Yeah, our project kind of has responsibilities in 2 places. We didn't go full hog on the client side with all of our business logic running in the browser. We have basically our domain objects are in the middle tier of Node.js, but we do have some logic that starts to get into the Angular side of things. I think it would be really cool if we got really brave and moved it all to the browser. Mr. Cameron?
Any particular concerns that I should be aware of in things that are best done on a desktop versus on mobile devices? You didn't talk at all about.
Oh, that's, it's interesting. So our project didn't have a requirement for mobile, which made me feel really weird. Dirty. That ng click, I don't know if that's a fast button implementation or not. When you're talking about mobile and you tap on a button, is it a 300 millisecond delay, DC? When you tap on something before that click actually runs. I don't know if that ng click is a fast button implementation or not. So it could, I don't know what that experience is going to be like. But generally speaking, I don't think there's going to be any issues porting an AngularJS application to a mobile context. If you combine that with Bootstrap, you actually get this responsive UI, this responsive layout with some really responsive behavior in a mobile context.
So on occasion we come across clients that are looking for offline capable. They need local storage.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things.
Yeah.
On mobile devices that are normally connected. With so much of the processing potentially available on a mobile device, can you talk about that at all?
Using local storage on mobile device?
With
We haven't done that, but you can definitely use that. That API, whatever API is available in the browser is available to AngularJS. I'm not aware of any. You guys correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not aware of any AngularJS service that allows you to talk to local storage, but just using JavaScript, you should be able to do that communication no problem. Anybody else? What about you guys that are using AngularJS on your own? What are your thoughts?
I don't see why I would use something else. Like really.
Yeah.
I mean, if you need to get the web app and you have obviously a platform runs in JavaScript, that's the language of the platform. Why are you going to use something like Java? It doesn't make sense. Especially when today you have something like Angular. Now you have to learn it. That's a problem. But in our project, I did not know Angular. Nobody knew. I also knew some, and we did not have any issues with Angular itself at all. Zero. And it was a small project, 2 months long. It looked great. It looks good. It was responsive. It is responsive. I mean, yeah. It's like lazy using Java for the front end. It's like lame.
There's definitely a training cost, and especially for people who already know jQuery,
Right.
they have to unlearn their jQuery mindset
Yes.
to then absorb the Angular mindset.
Yes.
Because most people in jQuery want to pre-position a whole bunch of assets and then do hide show kind of flashing.
Yes.
And Angular is more like, no, we just create it out of nothing and then it goes away.
Yeah.
It's a very different way of working. And I know Joshua has we had to kind of, and then they start to fight.
Yes.
Because the jQuery doesn't know Angular's there and Angular doesn't know jQuery's there.
Yeah. And you're tempted to start putting, this DOM manipulation code using jQuery in the controller, and that can get messy. John, I know you're using it on your own time. What are your thoughts on Angular?
I think you can build an app very quickly, so fast. If you want to do something in Java, like some JavaScript, something takes weeks. Angular, it's hours.
It's pretty fast. Are you writing tests in your project?
No, not yet, just mistake. Cool.
I think that's all I've got, guys, unless there are more questions. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.